I'm Stephanie from the Quilters Planner and from the blog Late Night Quilter, and today I want to show you how to sew our January block of the month pattern. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about and you have happened upon this video, if you purchased a 2018 Quilters Planner, here's what it looks like, it's a yearly planner, then you also got a complimentary copy of our magazine. And the magazine has 14 quilt patterns in it, gorgeous, beautiful layouts and instructions for how to sew all of them. And the one that we're working on together now in this video is the block of the month pattern. So here it is on the cover. And I'm going to show you some tips and tricks for sewing these blocks. So if you are going to sew along with us, you can follow us on Instagram at The Quilters Planner, or you can join our private Facebook group, and I will put the link in the comments below. And you can also check out our blog. Under the free patterns section we have, and on our blog, we have tips that we print every month that give you an idea of things you can do to make your sewing a little easier and to get better results. So I suggest that you look on our blog, and I'll put the link below again, and you can print these out and have them near you while you also have your pattern near you. Read through them both and you will be well prepared to sew these blocks. This is, I'd say, a beginner pattern for this block of the month program, but maybe an advanced beginner. But what's really great about it is through the process of sewing each block through this year, you are going to learn all sorts of new skills. It is a skill builder pattern, and you're going to be challenged. And sometimes it's not going to turn out perfectly. Your points aren't going to match up just right sometimes, or you may have cut something a little bit too small or too big. That's okay. We're not about being perfect as quilters, and I want you to embrace the imperfections. I know I have to every single day, so we'll do the best we can. I'll show you what I know that helps you get better results, but you have to promise that you're not going to stress about it if things don't work out perfectly. I won't if you won't, okay? So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is how to set yourself up to get the best results without stressing. And to do that, you need to do three things. You need to try and cut the most accurately that you can. You also need to be sure that you are gently pressing your fabrics and that you're not ironing the heck out of them. This is one of my weaknesses, and it's one of the things that I try and work on. And third, you need to work on having what we call a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to show you that first, because all that we're sewing here this whole year depends on having a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so let me go to the sewing machine and show you how you do it. So I want to talk about how to get a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. What is a scant 1/4 inch? It's just about a thread's width more narrow than a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'll show you that a little bit more, but what I want to talk to you about is this tool here. It's called the Ideal Seam Gauge, and I'll put the link to it in the comments below. It helps you measure a scant 1/4 inch. There's another brand that I really like called the Perkins scant 1/4 inch seam gauge, seam guide, and that's great too. So I'm going to put the link to both of them below. What you're going to do is you're going to look on the tool, and it will say, can you see? Scant 1/4 inch. Might be hard to see. You definitely need your reading glasses for it. It's tiny. And you're going to lower your foot and do your best to slowly, with your wheel, your hand wheel, lower your needle into the hole that says scant 1/4 inch. And then, separate little tool you need to get are these sticky seam guides. And they're replaceable. You can use them and then change where you position them. And we're going to set it right up against our ruler. And now we're going to use our hand wheel and roll our needle back up and gently pull the tool out. And now our fabric is going to bump up against this little sticky strip. You can also use moleskin or a few layers of tape or even a sticky note, but I find that those don't stay stuck very well. So I'm going to show you now what a scant 1/4 inch looks like. Let's put our fabric right sides together, and let's go ahead and sew. So I'm going to just let my fabric bump up against and cut our thread. And there we go. We've got our seam. And let me grab my little ruler here. This is my big ruler. And show you. If you can see, now I'm using a white thread, which of course makes it a little bit difficult, but this little black line is my 1/4 inch. And if you can see, my thread is just slightly on the inside there. It's slightly less than a 1/4 inch. That is a scant 1/4 inch. You may have a piecing foot that you use that has a little edge to it. And I suggest that for a lot of patterns you don't use it because you want a scant 1/4 inch, and that is a true 1/4 inch, and that's not what you're looking for. All right, now let's move on to the first step of actually sewing our block of the month. Okay, this is step 1 of block 1, the January block for the block of the month. So I want you to open your magazine to page 27 and check out what you need for block 1. All your fabric requirements and the size that you need to cut your pieces to are listed in the magazine. I'm not going to include those in this video because you do need to have your own copy of the magazine to be sewing along with us. So I'm just going to set the magazine aside over here. We're going to follow along, and I've labeled my fabrics so that they correspond to what you see in your copy of the magazine that you've got. So we've got A, which is shown kind of as a red. This is a little bit purpley, but you see it's kind of similar. And B, which is shown in the picture as pink. And C, which is shown in the picture of the magazine as yellow. And D is blue. And then we have fabric E, which is kind of like a focus fabric right in the center of the block. And it's shown as light purple in the magazine. And we have our fabric F, which are little triangles around the corner insides of the block. And it's shown as a dark blue. And then we have our background. BG is background fabrics, which is a white for this particular version that we're sewing together. So I've just printed out these little labels, and you might want to do the same thing on your own home computer and printer to keep your fabric straight once you cut. All right, so now the first thing that we're going to do is start making some half square triangles. Now, I am really excited to get to show you how to make a half square triangle. If you're new to quilting, this is a cornerstone of pretty much all quilting, and it's really wonderful to know how to do it. So we're going to take our square A with one of our square background fabrics that's the same size, 2 squares that are the same size, and we are going to layer them right sides together. And now I'm going to flip this one over because move these fabrics out of the way a little bit. It's easier to see the line that we're going to create, the lines on this lighter side of the fabric that I have for my background fabric. Right sides together, or as my friend Vanessa from Crafty Gemini says, pretty sides together. Of course, the white, both sides look the same, so it doesn't matter. And now you're going to take your ruler, and we're going to start by drawing one diagonal line from corner to corner. I'm going to use this friction pen. You've probably seen these in your sewing store. They disappear when you iron them, but they will reappear in cold weather. So only use these for drawing on your fabric when you're not going to see it on your seam allowances. So there's my center line, and now I'm going to take my 1/4 inch line on my ruler, and I'm going to set that 1/4 inch line on the center line. And I'm going to draw another line 1/4 inch away. Now I'm going to flip it around because I'm right-handed, so it's always easier for me to do it this way. And set the 1/4 inch line on the center line again and draw one more line down. So we have 3 sets of lines. We are going to sew on this line, and the center line is where we're going to cut. All right, so let's go to the sewing machine and sew, and I'm going to set up the other 4 half square triangle pieces, and I'll be right back, okay? Okay, so I have sewn on this pink line and this pink line, not on the center line. And if you can see, what is ideal is if you kind of sew right on the inside of this line instead of the outside of it, just slightly closer to your center line. On this one I kind of sewed right on it, but that's okay. But it's kind of closer to what we called the scant 1/4 inch if you're sewing on the inside of the line that you drew. So let's go ahead and cut our half square triangle right down the center. And now we're going to go over to the pressing table. A note, in this particular block 1, the January block, you only need one of these triangles. So you can save the other one for a second block and do a second one if you really like this block, or you can use it for another project. So first, we're going to press and set our seams. And remember, I used that friction pen so it makes my lines disappear. Remember, they will return in the cold weather. And I'm going to flip it over to the dark side, and now I just flip it up because I want my seam to be pressed to the dark side. It's the one time in life you want to go to the dark side. Okay, quilting humor. And then you're going to press it open like that. Same here. Open it up. So now we have to take our pressed half square triangles and trim them to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. There are a ton of ways that you can do this. I'm going to show you a couple of my favorite ways. So my absolute favorite is called the block lock ruler. I think this gives me incredibly accurate half square triangles. In order to use the block lock ruler, and I will provide the link in the description below, when we press, we need to press to one side, and that's, remember, we press to the dark side. Our block lock ruler, this creates a kind of a high side and a low side. So this bump is the high side of our fabric. The block lock logo goes on the low side of the fabric, and after I don't use this for a while, I always just kind of forget, so I made myself a label to remind myself that the logo goes on the low side. And this little line here is a groove that butts up against your diagonal, and it helps fix all sorts of problems with the half square triangles, like this little corner that's wobbly. We're going to fix that with this. So we bump it up against it. I have to try and get around my camera here to show you because this takes a little bit of pressure, and it's better to do this standing up in my opinion. So we're going to bump it up here, and we want to go to 4.5 inches, looking at this below. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 4.5 right there. And I want to leave a little bit of fabric on the other side of this 4.5 and a little bit up there, and I'm going to trim it. And here I'm going to pull my fabric so this is exactly on the diagonal and on the corner. And then I'm going to take my rotary cutter and trim. I slid a little bit there because my camera's kind of in the way. I'm going to try and step over it and cut in this direction. If you're standing right on top of it, that's not going to happen to you. Okay, and now I'm going to reach over and I'm going to grab the two opposite corners and spin my block this way and slide the ruler right up here and put it right at 4.5 and 4.5. Again, from my angle, it's a little bit tricky for me to see, but I think if I go like that, I'm barely cutting anything off, but you can hear it trim a little bit. Get that dog ear off. And there we go. Look, I didn't trim much, but just that is going to give us such a more beautiful block, 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. So that's my favorite method. Next, I want to show you a simpler method, and this uses the Quilt in a Day half square triangle ruler. I don't think that this is quite as accurate, but sometimes perfection is not the most important thing. Sometimes we really just need to be enjoying ourselves. And this is a much quicker option. So for this, you can see that the Quilt in a Day ruler has different numbers, measurements written on it. Halves are here, whole sizes are here. We need to square our half square triangle to 4.5 inches. So we're going to take this line and put it right on our seam line, and we're going to make sure that the tip of our triangle is lined up with the tip of the ruler. And press down and use your pinky and your finger to anchor it. And trim and trim. Let me say that if you press this after, you might get a little bit of distortion. But I think it really helped me to press it before and to starch before and not press it again if I don't have to, because I don't want to distort my block. And if I don't press it now, I think I'm going to have really good results. Keep it nice and straight. Sometimes with the pressure of ironing, it can really mess things up for you. And lastly, I'm going to show you what to do if you don't have these two rulers. So this is another block that I made that is not the same fabric, but I think you'll see what I'm saying. And this is just a square ruler that I had laying around, and it's actually a 5 by 5 inch ruler. Most rulers have a 45-degree diagonal line. You're going to use it for this. You're going to set that diagonal right on your diagonal, and we're going to look and see. I can see my fabric is hanging over a tiny bit over there, so let's push it over until it's just right and keep it on the diagonal and trim. I wiggled a little bit there, and then I'm going to just make sure that it's good on this end too, this side too, so keep it on the diagonal. Here's my 4.5 inch line here and here. It looks really good. Trim, trim, and that's the other way to do it. Okay, so you don't have to have these special tools, but they sure can make your life easier, and I really recommend them if you're going to be making quilts with a lot of half square triangles, and most of us do. Okay, let's move on to our next step. For step 1E, you're going to make more half square triangles with each of the other 3 fabrics that you chose. This one was A, B, C, and D. You're going to end up with 2 half square triangles for each of these squares, and you're only going to need to use 1. Now let's move on to step 2. Okay, so now we're going to move on to step 2. And step 2 is to make a split quarter square triangle, which sounds really complicated and different, but I promise you it's super easy. It's really just a fancy half square triangle. So the first step of it is to actually make a regular half square triangle, and you're going to use fabric F. Oh, let me show you what a split square triangle looks like when it's completed. Just like this. Okay, so let me show you how we make a split quarter square triangle. So the first step in part 2 of block 1's assembly is to take your fabric F, which is shown as a dark blue fabric in the picture in the magazine, and your background fabric, and both of these are cut to the same size. You had 2 different cuts of background fabric. Make sure you grab the correct one that matches the size of F. And we are going to layer them right sides together, and the first step is exactly like what we did before in step 1. We're going to make a half square triangle. I can already see that my cutting was not perfectly accurate, so we're going to make up for it with our careful seams, right? We hope. So we're laying our fabrics right sides together. We're going to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner, and then a 1/4 inch away another diagonal line, and then a 3rd diagonal line on the opposite side of that center cutting line, like that. 3 lines in a row, a 1/4 inch apart, and then I'm going to sew on this line and this line. Center we will cut later. One of the reasons I also like using this sticky tape measurement guide is because it doesn't get in the way when I'm sewing half square triangles the way a piecing foot would. Remember, if you can, sew just on the inside of that pink line, closer to the center cutting line. Cut our thread and turn it around. So we did this twice with sewing our seams here and here, and we're going to cut, making them into half square triangles, and then we take them over to the pressing board and we're going to press them, open them up, and then we're going to trim them just like we did before. So now I've trimmed these to 5 by 5, and I need to now do the next step for our split quarter square triangle. So I'm going to take another 5 by 5 background piece and put it right on top, and we're going to basically take the next step to do another half square triangle, right sides together, except I'm going to turn my work and I'm going to do a diagonal line. And this white fabric is great because you can actually see through it. Here's my half square triangle. I'm going to draw my diagonal line this way. And then we're going to do a line a 1/4 inch away again, just like we do when we're making half square triangles. We're just doing it perpendicular to the seam that we did before, and that's the most important thing. It must be perpendicular to the seam that you did before. Now we're going to sew again on this line and cut on this line, press, and we're going to have our split quarter square triangle. I'll be right back while I go sew these seams. Alright, so I grabbed another fun tool that you might want to consider investing in because it makes trimming up half square triangles and split quarter square triangles much easier. And it's my Olfa rotating mat, and I'll put a link to it below so you can see how I use that. And it's also small and portable, so it's really nice for our filming days. You can actually use your block lock ruler or your Quilt in a Day half square triangle trimming ruler to square up your split quarter square triangles too. I'm getting much better at saying that. It's been a lot of practice. So the way that I do that is I look at this last seam that I pressed open, and this becomes my diagonal, and I have my low side and my high side just like before. So my block lock ruler goes on the low side, and I'm going to trim this to 4.5 inches. So I've butted it up against the diagonal. I see that I have a little bit hanging over the 4.5 mark, which is perfect because I know that I'm not over trimming. And I'm going to go cut here. And here's where my nifty turning mat comes into handy, which I should have pulled it out earlier because I think it would have made my life easier in filming land. And instead of spinning my block lock, I can spin that and just move it up. And now I move it back up to 4.5 inches. Make sure that I'm right up against the diagonal, trim, and trim. Okay, if you don't have the block lock ruler or you don't have the Quilt in a Day ruler, check our tips on our blog, and we show you some pictures of how you can use a regular ruler. And I'll remind you of how we use this Quilt in a Day half square triangle ruler too. I did press this already and starch it, and I really prefer to do that. And then I close it again. We're squaring up to 4.5, so I find the 4.5 inch mark on my Quilt in a Day ruler, and I put the red dotted line on my seam line, and I line up my triangle tip right at the top. From where I'm sitting, it's a little hard to see, so you might need to stand up to see that. And then trim my nice rotating mat, and trim, and I took away just enough that would have messed up my accuracy, and now I have a perfect 4.5 inch split quarter square triangle. 2 different methods of cutting. All right, so I'm going to trim up the other 2, and then we're going to put this whole block together. So now we're on step 3, which is our row assembly. So we are going to put our top row together. We're going to take one of the dark red block, and then we're going to take one of our split quarter square triangles, and we need to orient it so the little mountain top is pointed upward. And then we're going to take our pink fabric, which was B, we made into a half square triangle, and orient it like that. We're just going to sew these 3 together, easy peasy. And then we're going to do row Y below it, which is this guy oriented like that. I have to check myself on the orientation because sometimes this is where you can mess up. And then I took our center square fabric, which was E. This is the one that I chose. And then we've got one more split quarter square triangle that's pointing outward. the little mountaintop pointing outward. That's the second row. And then our last row, which is going to be one of our C fabrics pointing inward, and then our last split quarter square triangle here, and then finally our D half square triangle, which is here. Remember, you have 2 of each of these and you don't need them all for one block. You can use them, save them for a second block, because this is so much fun, right? When you are putting this together, it does not matter how this diagonal goes on all of these split quarter square triangles. You can orient that diagonal whichever way, it doesn't matter, okay? Now let's sew these together. The only thing that's tricky about this is how to get nice points all lined up. And remember what I said at the beginning of the video? It really doesn't matter. Don't stress out so much about it. But saying that, I know that a ton of you are going to email me and be like, I couldn't get my points right. How do I do it? So I'm going to show you. I am a glue baster. So I'm going to show you how I glue these together instead of pinning, and how it helps me get my points lined up perfectly in these corners. So let me show you. Let me take you to my glue table, which is really my pressing table. Here we go, back over here. You ready? So we are still on step 3, arranging row X, and let's talk about how to get perfect points. You have a couple of options. You certainly can use pins in the traditional method, and if you do that, I just pin right in the seam here. This is my method. Not everybody may do that. And then I would pin again here and take it over to the machine and sew. But for me personally, the pins don't always work out that well. And so when I really need to get a block precise, I will go use glue basting. This is by Roxanne, and it's a glue basted kit. You might find it in your local store. There's another brand by Purple Daisies. I believe that Christy Fincher and her mom, Sharon Chamber, really came up with this concept of glue basting, and they use it for binding too, and they're show quilters, and so it's important to get their points perfect. And they have their own glue and tips that you can buy on their website, and I'll give you the link to that as well. This has a very fine tip, and it's a metal, this brand, and it's available at a lot of stores. But I want to caution you about leaving this metal tip on, because on the inside, the glue can go up into the tip, and then it can drip back down if you leave it, and it can cause your glue to rust inside, and then the whole bottle is no good. So you can store this separately and take it off and put the top back on, and hopefully try and avoid the rust situation. Or you can buy from Purple Daisies, and their glue tips have plastic and you won't ever get rust. It's your choice. So let's go ahead and figure out our glue basting. So what I'm going to do is take my glue and just put a tiny bit right along the edge. I would say at like 1/8 of an inch. And I'm going to make sure that I'm orienting this correctly. This is how we want to sew it together, right? Stop me if I'm wrong, guys, right? This is the kind of place where I make mistakes. And then I'm going to line up my fabric on top of it and then give it a press with my hot iron. And that kind of sets the glue. But this is washable glue. So once you wash your quilt top, this glue is going to be gone. And now I'm going to take it over to my machine, and I'm going to sew here at a scant 1/4 inch, what we set up at the very beginning. You ready? Let's go sew. And now, looks good to me. We don't have any point issues yet. Let's go back and do the same thing, glue baste this other side, and sew it on, okay? Right. So I've put drops of glue 1/8 of an inch or so. Make sure that I've oriented my half square triangle correctly. My tip of this little mountain is here. We're going to line it all up. And so this glue just takes the place of pins, and it's much more, for me, more precise. And give it a press. Doesn't take long. Set that glue. Make sure you're using some sort of ironing board or sheet that is not important to you. And here we go. We're going to check our instructions because our designer, Cheryl Brickey, has given you some nice pressing directions. We're going to do row 2 and then row 3 in exactly the same way in the layout that I showed before. 1, 2, 3, or in this, I guess we call it X, Y, and Z. And then we'll come back and I'll show you how to glue baste one more time to get the 3 rows together, because that's when it's most important to get your points right. Okay, I just want to say a word about pressing your seams. You can choose to press your seams open, or you can follow the directions in the book, in the magazine. As I mentioned before, row X, we're going to press our seams outward toward the outside edges of the block. And you can use a little starch if you want to, because I think it does help you in getting your points together. But be really careful at this point that you're not stretching your fabric and that you're not killing it with your iron, because you've worked so hard to get your triangles perfectly. Now the second row, which is row Y, we're going to press inward. And the reason that we're doing this is Cheryl wants us to try and nest our seams, which is another trick for getting your points to line up correctly. Some people do prefer to press their seams open. So instead of pressing to one side or the other, they actually press it open. Depends on my mood. It takes a little bit of extra time, and I feel like it doesn't nest my seams as well. But it just depends. Sometimes I do it. And also, if you're going to use that block lock ruler, remember you have to press to one side, because you need one side of your block to be higher than the other. You need to basically have a ditch. Also, if you're sending your work to a long armor to be quilted in the end, they kind of prefer that you have a ditch too. Most of them, probably not everybody, because if they're going to do any stitch in the ditch for you, or if you're going to stitch in the ditch after in your quilting phase, it's nice to actually have a ditch. And if you've pressed it open, you don't. So it looks like we've got our seams lined up pretty well. So let's see if we can use our glue basting trick to get them so they're really pretty. All right. So first we're going to take row X and attach it to row Y. And so I'm going to take a little bit of the glue and put it about 1/8 of an inch across all the way along on row Y. You don't need to use a ton of it. Little droplets are totally okay. And I actually stand up for this part, and I'm going to start out at my seam. And I'm going to make sure that I turn it up and kind of peek underneath and line it up directly and grab my iron and just press that seam. And now I'm going to go over here to the other one that I'm trying to line up so precisely. So I bend it up like this, peek underneath, pull it up like that, and press. Now those are the most important parts, so now I can just more gently press the rest of it, right? And now theoretically, we didn't have to worry about pins here. We don't have to worry about sewing over pins or removing pins. We can just take it straight to the machine and our points should turn out perfect. All right, not too shabby. And now I'm going to do the same thing with this bottom piece. On row Z, 1/8 of an inch glue. If you want, you can just start out with gluing here and here and add the glue to the rest later. Flip this upside down and start with those tricky seams that we're going to be lining up. Once you can master the concept of lining up these seams, you can really sew any block in the world, I think. Next one. There we go. Press it. And then you can also, if you need to, ease in a little bit, even with glue basting, and pull out that bottom piece that was tucked under a little bit and stretch it just a tiny, tiny bit if you need to. Back to the pressing table one more time. I'm just going to set the seam and get rid of any of the little wobbles and wrinkles that were there. And let's see. Dun, dun, dun. Pretty good. Pretty good. And that's good enough, right? Okay. So we've got a tiny bit off here, But I think that's great, and nobody's going to know, especially after you quilt this. You'll never, ever, ever notice any of those points that aren't exactly lined up. And there is our beautiful block 1. Your finished block should measure at 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. You want to make sure that you always have a 1/4 of an inch or a scant 1/4 of an inch above the points of your triangles. Okay, thank you for joining me for block 1, and we will meet up again, and I will give you my tips for block 2, which is flying geese.